Okay, welcome to the podcast. So, this chemist guy named Kekule was working out the shape of some chemical compound when one night he fell asleep by the fire and woke up from a dream of a snake eating its own tail, the famous Ouroboros image. And when he woke up with that image in his head from the dream, he declared, Eureka, it's a ring. The molecule is a ring. The molecule I've been thinking about, trying to understand its structure, is a ring. So this is how Cormac McCarthy introduces the problem of the unconscious mind. In a minute, I'm going to discuss his, magical book, The Road. I love Cormac McCarthy. He's my favorite living writer. The guy he really gets it. And I've been thinking about doing an episode on him for a while. But it's like you can't summarize a Cormac McCarthy book. There's no point in doing that. At best, and maybe in the future, what I'll try to do is rather than summarize any of these books in an episode, is just to sort of talk about them for people who have read them, which, maybe none of you, but maybe someone will find the video and that's worth it to me. But before I get to The Road and talk about some of it, I wanted to deal with this essay that was published in Nautilus by Cormac McCarthy, who has a residency or something at the Santa Fe Institute, which I think is out in New Mexico or Arizona or something. And so he wrote this essay for the Santa Fe Institute or whatever to be published by this Nautilus website. I'll post the picture of it here and a link in the description. So the question for Cormac McCarthy is, in the case of Kekule, and so this happens all the time, right? These revelatory dreams that kind of solve the problems we're working on. Or my wife will sometimes, she calls it sending out the horses. When you've got a word you're trying to think of or a thing you're trying to remember and you can't quite get it, and so you send the horses out and you just forget about it. And then 6 hours later or something, all of a sudden while you're cooking dinner that night, the answer is presented to you by the unconscious. And you have not thought about it consciously in 6 hours, right? So the question for McCarthy is, why does the unconscious present the answer often as an image? In the case of Kekule, in a dream. Why doesn't it just whisper to us in language? Why didn't it just wake Kekule up saying, it's a ring, man, the molecule is a ring, with words? Why does the unconscious rarely use language? So, in addition to orchestrating all of our biological processes, the unconscious thinks for us. It is a machine for operating the organism. So that means it makes your heart beat and it keeps your kidneys regulating your blood and all of that stuff. But it also seems to work on our problems for us. As McCarthy puts it, quote, problems in general are often well posed in terms of language, and language remains a handy tool for explaining them. But the actual process of thinking in any discipline is largely an unconscious affair. End quote. And McCarthy doubles down and says, if you believe that language isn't much used in thinking about... Sorry, let me start that over again. McCarthy doubles down and says, language isn't used much in thinking about problems. And he says, if you believe that you use language in thinking, he says, write to me and explain the process. It's sort of a challenge, and I think he's right, because it doesn't really make sense. You don't it's not words that we do our thinking in. Instead, language is just the reporter. Language just sums up the results. But the thinking happens before language. So, quoting again here, I'm going to do a lot of quoting in this episode from this essay. Here, McCarthy says, quote, "I've pointed out to some of my mathematical friends that the unconscious appears to be better at math than they are. My friend George Zwig calls this the night shift. Bear in mind that the unconscious has no pencil or notepad and certainly no eraser. That it does solve problems in mathematics is indisputable. How does it go about it? When I've suggested to my friends that the unconscious, it may well do it without using numbers, most of them thought, after a while, that this was a possibility. How? We don't know. Just as we don't know how it is that we manage to talk. If I am talking to you, then I can hardly be crafting at the same time the sentences that are to follow what I am now saying. I'm totally occupied in talking to you. Nor can some part of my mind be assembling these sentences and then saying them to me so that I can repeat them. Aside from the fact that I'm busy, this would be to evoke an endless regress. The truth is that there is a process here to which we have no access. It is a mystery, opaque to total blackness." And from here, McCarthy begins to pose an even bigger challenge. He says, yes, look, some people think language is an emergent biological evolutionary thing. They think it started crude and then it developed into what it is now. But not so fast. I mean, these people are missing the real mystery here. And let's define language as McCarthy does. He says basically like when a prairie dog or a bird or whatever yelps its warning call, its single note, that's not language, that's signaling. But language is where one thing can be another thing. And by the way, I'll just notice, there is no relationship between the word and the thing it indicates. Like, book, the sound book, doesn't resemble in any way a book. It's an arbitrary signifier, so it can be, Libra in another language, and it's still book, right? It's just one thing can be a wholly other thing in our minds. So let's see. So one thing can be another thing. The next interesting piece of this puzzle is that as far as we can tell and imagine, language seems to have arisen only once in one species, us, and it arose very, very quickly, or it spread very, very quickly once it arose, right? So listen to more from McCarthy here. I'll just quote him rather than try to summarize the rest of this. And enjoy his writing style here. Quote, "The sort of isolation that gave us tall and short and light and dark and other variations in our species was no protection against the advance of language. It crossed mountains and oceans as if they weren't there. Did it meet some need? No. The other 5,000 plus mammals among us do fine without it. But useful? Oh yes. We might further point out that when it arrived, it had no place to go. The brain was not expecting it and had made no plans for its arrival. It simply invaded those areas of the brain that were the least dedicated. I suggested once in a conversation at the Santa Fe Institute that language had acted very much like a parasitic invasion, and David Krakauer, our president, said that the same idea had occurred to him, which pleased me a good deal because David is very smart." End quote. So yeah, the point here is that unlike a virus or whatever, language is not biological. It's hard to imagine a pre-existing component of the brain was there ready to receive language, like if language had never existed before. And yet, in some way, it must have been there in humans, or else they would not have received it, the way that monkeys can't receive it when we try to teach it to them. It's really interesting. And by the way, for me at least, there's that resonance again with like, in the beginning was the word. It does suggest that something about language is like at the very origin of human, right? One interesting note that McCarthy adds here is that there are no languages whose form is in a state of development. And you have to think about that for a second, but it's kind of interesting. As in, partially finished languages. I mean, of course, languages are changing, but they are all already like sufficient for the purposes of what they do. Instead, they're all fully capable of describing the world. Again, that seems to indicate that they would begin with, like, the name of things at the very beginning. Like the first language, the language, must have begun with like someone understanding this thing about how one thing can be another thing. Book, the word, can be this. Okay, but then it would very quickly evolve, not evolve, but like become, the ability to describe various concepts and whatever, the whole thing. But it must have happened all very quickly once the idea of language was kind of clicking in the organism. Now, 2 more paragraphs from the essay. Quote, "So what are we saying here? That some unknown thinker sat up one night in his cave and said, 'Wow, one thing can be another thing.' Yes, of course that's what we're saying. Except that he didn't say it because there was no language for him to say it in. For the time being, he had to settle for just thinking it. And when did this take place? Our influential persons claim to have no idea. Of course, they don't think that it took place at all. But aside from that, 100,000 years ago, 500,000, longer? Actually, 100,000 would be a pretty good guess. It dates the earliest known graphics found to the Blombos Cave in South Africa. These scratchings have everything to do with our chap waking up in his cave. For while it is fairly certain that art preceded language, it probably didn't precede it by much. Some influential persons have actually claimed that language could be up to 1 million years old. They haven't explained what we have been doing with it all this time. What we do know, pretty much without question, is that once you have language, everything else follows pretty quickly. The simple understanding that one thing can be another thing is at the root of all things of our doing. From using colored pebbles for the trading of goats to art and language, and on to using symbolic marks to represent pieces of the world too small to see." 1 more paragraph from McCarthy. Quote, "100,000 years is pretty much an eye blink, but 2 million years is not. This is, rather loosely, the length of time in which our unconscious has been organizing and directing our lives, and without language, you will note, at least for all but that recent blink. How does it tell us where and when to scratch? We don't know. We just know that it's good at it. But the fact that the unconscious prefers avoiding verbal instructions pretty much altogether, even where they would appear to be quite useful, suggests rather strongly that it doesn't much like language, and even that it doesn't trust it. And why is that? How about for the good and sufficient reason that it has been getting along quite well without it for a couple million years." End quote. Well, I hope you're loving this with me. I used to know a bunch of guys in rhetoric, and it used to bug me how they acted as if rhetoric was everything and everything was rhetoric. They would even claim that thinking required rhetoric. I tried pointing to like Leonardo's manuscript pages where he just drew drawings of mechanisms for page after page with no linguistic annotations, but there was clearly like a complicated sequence going on there. But my friends just like couldn't get it. They believed that language was the basis of thought. But McCarthy is saying they're very wrong about that. Thought precedes language in the unconscious, problem-solving mind. By the way, before I go on with this, I was talking yesterday, my sister-in-law who's visiting, my wife's left-handed, and we were talking about handedness, and how, to me, it's very interesting that handedness is not evenly distributed. Like, you might expect it to be 50-50. Why wouldn't it just be, or 100-0, I guess, one way or another. But the fact that it's like 89% of people are right-handed or something and 11% are left-handed is odd. Like, what's going on there? And of course, as we know, like, generally, I think there's something about this, right? Like, we know that the right side of the brain seems to be the creative, more nonverbal or like mystical side of the brain, the creative, like expressive side of the brain. Whereas the left side of the brain tends to do categories and mathematics, probably, and and like that kind of stuff. But and also, of course, it seems there's something that where the right side of the brain controls the left hand and left side of the body, and vice versa. And so there's a suggestion in here that well, is it possible that handedness, the dominance of right-handedness, suggests the general dominance of left-brainedness in our epoch? But that suggests that it could go another way. What if there was another sort of society? This is where Julian Jaynes becomes interesting, right? The bicameral civilization or something, where let's say there was a people that was less talky, less categorizing, less rational in the sense that I mean here, enlightenment rational, categorizing and and so on, but that they were more kind of live by the whim, follow the sound of the chirping bird in the forest and stuff. And this people might be more inclined to left-handedness because they're more inclined to right-brainedness. Anyway, this is total speculation, but there's a lot of things to think about here. So McCarthy gives the example of your recollection of the 100 or whatever 1,000 books you've read. I mean, if someone names a title, say from any title from my catalog of episodes, I can discuss any one of these books with a reasonable recollection of the details and the plot and the characters and the setting and so on, even if I can't recall any of the specific words. In fact, right now from this book, I've read it 2 or 3 times probably, and I remember very many scenes very vividly in my head. I think there's one line that I can recall the words to, maybe one line, and that's not even an imagistic line. So it's interesting that somehow, I mean, what happens what seems to happen is, though I can discuss all that stuff, the plot and whatever, I can't recall any of the specific words, and that suggests that our minds seem to make, our unconscious minds make images out of the language we're reading in these novels. And then, the unconscious preserves the images and discards the text from our memory. In this way, the unconscious seems to be the organizer and editor of our experience, the narrator, you might say. It decides what to preserve and what to delete. And McCarthy detects a kind of moral guardianship happening here, which is fascinating. He says, quote, "The unconscious wants to give guidance to your life in general, but it doesn't care what toothpaste you use." The unconscious is a biological operative, he says over and over again, and language is not. And that is fascinating, right? The unconscious seems to care about you, which is why it sends you these dreams encoded as parables, but often where nobody speaks, interestingly, to help you resolve the quandaries and anxieties of life. But it strongly prefers to communicate with us, again, without using language. Probably, McCarthy says, because that's what it did for 2 million years before language, like a virus or something, tried to interpose itself into us, which is, it's a strange thing to think about here. Anyway, by the way, as I said, note that some of you will recognize the Julian Jaynes-ish thinking going on here. McCarthy doesn't mention Jaynes. I imagine he's probably aware of him there, but I mean, the Julian Jaynes book is about 600 pages. It's pretty dense. I mean, it's really good. If you've read the Iliad and the Odyssey, it helps. But if you don't have time for all that and you want kind of a primer for Julian Jaynes, this little essay by McCarthy is a really good way to get to thinking about this. Anyway, here's how McCarthy ends this essay. He says, quote, "The unconscious seems to know a great deal. What does it know about itself? Does it know that it's going to die? What does it think about that? It appears to represent a gathering of talents rather than just one. It seems unlikely that the itch department is also in charge of math? Can it work on a number of problems at once? Does it only know what we tell it? Or, more plausibly, has it direct access to the outer world? Some of the dreams which it is at pains to assemble for us are no doubt deeply reflective, and yet some are quite frivolous. And the fact that it appears to be less than insistent upon our remembering every dream suggests that sometimes it may be working on itself. And is it really so good at solving problems, or is it just that it keeps its own counsel about the failures? How does it have this understanding, which we might well envy? How might we make inquiries of it? Are you sure? End quote. Okay, now if you're following all this, first of all, I'm going to talk about his novels in just a second. But first, because we've talked about this some on this channel, and because I watched one of Arvel's videos yesterday, and it struck me again, and he mentioned specifically Carl Jung and the idea of like the intuitive versus the whatever it is, the categorizing mind there, and like he said, and he's right, like you have to be both. These I've always struggled on those like Myers-Briggs test because I always get about 50-50 on all of them. It's like, why would you be all an introvert or all an extrovert? That seems like imbalance to me. I'm gonna sneeze again. So, but if you're thinking with me about philosophy here, and in relation to thought, I mean, for example, you all know how Wittgenstein ends the Tractatus where he says, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. I mean, that is kind of a limitation on philosophy, right? That, like, basically we expect philosophy to be speakable. But, like, that's a limit that language doesn't necessarily face. Isn't that funny? No, that's a limit that thought doesn't necessarily face, where language does face it, right? So in philosophy, you might feel like you're approaching some idea that is like, you can kind of visualize it, but you can't yet put it into words. We do this, right? We go like, especially when you're talking with someone, you're trying to explain an idea, and you'll go like, well, I mean, you have this kind of like the whole kind of, like this whole book is in my head. But if you say like, tell me what it says, I'm gonna have to like, there's this act of translation where I go, well, let me say, it's like, it's about this father and son. It's after like some apocalyptic disaster, and they're trying to survive. Okay, so that's like my 2-sentence summary of the novel. But like, what's going on there is that I'm forced to reduce to language something that is kind of bigger than language. I mean, bigger than language in the sense that like, well, it would take me the 20 or 10 hours it would take to read this out loud to give you the exact idea of it. And even then, like, there's images in it that kind of go beyond the written language, if that makes sense. So the question seems to be like, can we think using images rather than using language? This may be a different kind of thinking. I had a professor in grad school who was, he was a history of thought professor, and one of his things that he was interested in was this question, I guess. I mean, he was, for example, he was always interested in like mechanisms and stuff. He was into, what do you call those, catapults and trebuchets and stuff. He would literally go build a trebuchet in a field and then like, sort of figure out how they were constructed and so on. And he said a lot of this was non-linguistic thought, and he actually gave me the example of Leonardo. I guess he wrote part of his dissertation on Leonardo's folios and some of these pages where he's got like 9 pages in a row of just drawings and drawings and drawings of various mechanisms, kind of showing like basically assembly instructions or something. But no language. He doesn't write the order in which you're to do them or where to look on the page. And of course, he's left-handed, so there's this backwards thing that you might have to read and so on. Okay, so my hypothesis here is that, like, part of what novels can be useful for is for the kind of thinking that, like, is that the unconscious likes to do, that goes a little bit beyond prosaic truth claims. So yeah, like, well, I'll just, like, again, maybe give you the 5-sentence summary of this book. It's really cool. First of all, the cover fits the setting. Like, the setting is this burnt out world where, like, almost everybody is dead and all the trees are dead and there seems to be almost no life. So we imagine some kind of, like, there it is, some sort of like apocalyptic, I don't know, like World War III, or, you know, bombs, or whatever, like a sun flare or something. And very few people survived, and so they're kind of living as, like, scavengers off of, like, canned foods that they can find and so on. And the title refers to the road. It always seemed to me like it's this road from somewhere in the mountains of, like, Appalachia toward, like, Charleston. So they're kind of walking down. I picture I-74 because I guess I live near there, and you're like, but everything's burnt out. The houses are all abandoned, and there's just these, like, roving tribes of pirates, and I mean, it's scary, and it's this dad just trying to survive with his kid, and they have almost no food, and it's just like, it's so bleak. Everything's black and white. The language is so sparse. I mean, you know, there's death everywhere. I remember there's this one scene where they discover like an underground survival bunker somehow, and they lift the lid up and go down in there, and there's, like, canned foods galore, and there's a light that works, and they're safe, you know, because it's, like, buried under the ground, and it's like, yes, like, we found our oasis, you know, but it's only, like, a 6-foot by 4-foot room, and, ooh, technical error there. Anyway, it's like a small room that they've discovered with all the canned food and stuff in it, and you know, they're just eating these apricots, and it's like, oh, thank God. But then, like, what are you gonna do? Like, after 2 or 3 days, the dad is like, we can't stay in here. I mean, this isn't life, you know, and so we have to kind of go and keep looking. And it's like they don't even know what they're looking for, kind of. I mean, I guess vaguely they're looking for other people, but, you know, other people you can't really trust. Like, there's one scene, I think some guy tries to steal they're pushing a grocery cart the whole way through the novel. And, you know, then toward the end of the novel, anyway, the dad gets sick, and the boy is probably 10 or something, and it's just this scary thing about how they're just, death is haunting them and so on. And, I just want to read you the very last. I'm not even going to tell you what happens to the boy and the dad and all that stuff. But it resolves, I mean, it comes to a nice ending with all of that. But then there is one paragraph at the end of the novel that I do want to read to you. And, oh, actually, before I read you this, there's one other part that I was going to mention. So, like, again, it's just, like, pressing difficulty and death and this just oppressively bleak scenery. So difficult, you know what I mean? You read this book and you're like, it's just tragic to get through page after page. There's one other note of relief in the book when they discover like an apple orchard on their walk, and they're so hungry, and they find this apple orchard, but it's like March or something. So all of the apples are from last fall, and they're kind of these withered little brown balls, you know. But they're like so happy to have them, and they just kind of like eat them and suck the juice out of them. And I mean, it's like, you know, in normal life, like I've been I'm so spoiled that it's like I'm the guy who goes to the grocery store and kind of flips the apples over and, you know, discard any of them that has a little bruise on it, or I'll cut the brown part off of my apple or something. But it just shows that, like, in a circumstance where you're actually hungry, like, you would just suck the juice out of this gross brown worm-eaten apple, you know. But that's pretty much it. I mean, there's death. There's a scene where there's, like, people in the basement holding hostage these living people that they're cutting meat off of. And that's one of the themes of the book, too, is that the dad and the son are, like, carrying the fire. They're trying not to be, well, you know, demons, right, in this very difficult circumstance. But some people have just gone full demonic, and they're like I said, they're holding these people hostage so that they can eat them slowly, like so they don't die all at once. So they'll just like chop a leg off and then, eat the meat off the leg, but tourniquet the rest of the leg so they can eat them later or something. It's like, ugh. There's a scene with a dead baby and stuff. And so the dad and the son, it's like you're not just looking for anyone, you're looking for like, the good people, basically. So anyway, that's the novel. I'm not going to blow the ending for you. It's really the best novel. It's like one of the best novels. I love it. And you're not gonna be able to appreciate this last paragraph totally, but because it's like a symphony. It's like you have to appreciate the buildup of the language and so on. But you'll get it a little bit. So this is what he writes. Once there were brook trout in the streams in the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current, where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. On their backs were vermiculate patterns that were maps of the world in its becoming, maps and mazes, of a thing which could not be put back, not be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man, and they hummed of mystery. And that is, to me, one of the best endings of a novel that I've ever read, because it's like you've read this whole story of the dad and the son, and how it turns out, and then it's like, how are we really going to end this? You know what I mean? Like, there's really no ending that's kind of good enough, and so what he does is he gives you instead this kind of set image. There once were trout colored like a rainbow, and the water was amber, and they had these vermiculate patterns that reflected everything. And of course what you're doing here is you're realizing there aren't trout anymore. The rivers are dead, it's not so much that's a part, there is no narrative there. It doesn't tell you anything about the dad and the son. It's not really but it's it's an image, and the image is sort of, it's a tone, right? And it's a thought, but it's not a verbal thought. There's a poem by, let me see if I can pull this up real quick. I gave you the poem by, you should scroll back a few episodes if you haven't watched it, the poem by Wallace Stevens, called No Ideas But the... What is it? No ideas but things or something? No ideas but in things themselves or something. But there's a William Carlos Williams poem that also says the same thing. This was like a movement in poetry in sort of the early 20th century. And this very short poem, I'll post it up here, you can look at it with me, called A Sort of Song. So WCW here says, "Let the snake wait under his weed, and the writing be of words, slow and quick, sharp to strike, quiet to wait, sleepless. Through metaphor to reconcile the people and the stones. Compose. No ideas but in things. Invent. Saxifrage is my flower that splits the rocks." End poem. And you might not know what saxifrage is, but it's this tough little flower that can grow up in the cracks of concrete. So saxifrage. And again, this is like what McCarthy is saying when he says that one thing can be something else, right? It's like language is that, and metaphor is that. That's the thing, is so when he says, he's talking about how words can be things, and it's compose no ideas but in things. Give me an image of it. Give me an analogy. That's the thing I want to say. And it's this isn't to take anything away from philosophy. I do like philosophy. I like reading philosophy. I love hearing people talk about it. But my favorite moments in that are where the philosopher goes, "It is like," and then he gives me an analogy that brings it into focus. And this is beautiful. So saxifrage is my flower that splits the rocks. That is, like, basically poetry can be that, right? Words can become images in your head, and those images are thoughts. And this is a way of thinking that's probably closer to the deep, ancient, sort of even almost, not pre-human, I mean it was human, but pre-linguistic way of thinking. That's the interesting thing about the Kekule Problem in McCarthy's essay. It's like we were human, fully human, for like 1 million or 2 million years, thinking with the unconscious, all this equipment going on, and only then came language. So what was it like to do this thinking without language? In my biggest thinking moments, I do sometimes turn to like drawing. And I'm not very good at it, but like it's a perfect sort of meditative thing to do when you've stumped yourself on a problem you're thinking, oh, you're trying to write about something or you're trying to express something. Put it down and like try to draw a self-portrait or something. This is a different kind of thinking. And the same goes for, like I said, you know, I don't know, like hunting for mushrooms in the forest or something. Like you're learning a thing and you're kind of thinking about you or like I used to fish. Like fishing is a great example of this. Fishing, you learn to think like a fish. And of course fish don't have language. They think about things like cover and water temperature and season and so on. And so you have to like you put aside your linguistic brain and you project your mind, your thinking mind into 6 feet under the water by the stump, and you become like you are the fish in the water. You can kind of do that with your mind. And so this sort of thinking, I think, is really helpful sometimes in pushing past like dead ends of thought, or when you are having a hard time, expressing a thing. So anyway, whatever. The point is, like, I'm trying to defend a certain kind of novel, and McCarthy writes that kind of novel. If I do an episode on McCarthy, I'll another one on one of his novels. It probably won't be The Road. It probably won't be Suttree, which I love, but I think I'll probably choose Child of God and just try to give you like a short summary of it, because I don't know. I mean, just like, or maybe Blood Meridian. I know everyone loves Blood Meridian, but like, I almost feel like it's a waste of time, because really the point of it is when you read those books, the images get in your head, and I won't be able to do that for you as effectively, as he will. He's the artist of constructing these images. A summary of it has already lost the language, and now I'm just trying to give you the image, and I'm not a maestro of that. All right, well, thanks for listening. Talk to you next time on The Godward Show.